At the beginning of the film, Mrs. Wiryo visits her housekeeper Inda to check on her sick daughter Ismi, who has been suffering from a high fever for some time. She advises Inda that she herself must stay calm if she wants Ismi to stay calm. We then see Retno, who has got a job in the city and is leaving tomorrow. Her father tells her to look for a better apartment for the next month and assures her that he will pay for it. Then they leave, and it becomes clear that there is tension between Mr. and Mrs. Wiryo. He tells her that they need to discuss their problems as they can no longer ignore each other. But Mrs. Wiryo remains silent. Meanwhile, a truck approaches from the opposite direction and collides with their car. Retno, who arrives at the scene of the accident devastated, is horrified to see the bodies of her parents. She starts crying next to her mother's body, and in the meantime, we see Wiryo getting up. After a while, he calls for Retno, who is startled when she hears him, and when she turns around, she realizes that Wiryo is not there. Retno is in shock, and suddenly Wiryo pounces on her, waking her from her sleep. Later, Retno tells Inda about her dream, who reassures her and explains that it was just a dream and that she will take care of Retno's parents. At that moment, there is a knock at the door, and when they come out, they hear the sad news of Retno's parents' accident. Next, we see Retno and her sister Wati in the hospital, weeping over their mother's lifeless body. They then go to Wiryo, who is in a coma. Retno expresses that she would feel guilty if they did not do everything they could, to which Wati replies that he's only alive because of the machines, and she feels guilty for holding him back. Retno suggests that maybe a miracle could happen, but Wati admits that while she wants a miracle too, they have to be realistic. She adds that the money they spend every time her father takes medication could feed them for a whole month, and suggests that he should spend the rest of his life with them. They bring Wiryo home, and Wiryo's second wife Guillem and son Tarjo also attend Mrs. Wiryo's funeral. They offer their condolences to Retno and Wati, and Guillem apologizes for not being able to go to the hospital. Wati replies that they could not have done anything if they had come, but Retno says they are grateful that they are here. Afterwards, they meet Wiryo and Guillem apologizes to him. Tarjo feels uncomfortable and asks his mother to excuse him for a moment. As he leaves, Guillem asks Retno if she can recite the Quran for a while, to which Retno replies in the affirmative and says she will wait outside. As Retno comes out, she overhears Wati telling Tarjo how he can talk about inheritance when their father is still alive, to which Tarjo explains that they are both facing financial difficulties and their father's inheritance could help solve their problems. Later, while prayers are being held outside, Guillem is sitting next to Wiryo, crying. When her glasses accidentally fall, she bends down to pick them up, and when she stands back up, she is shocked to see Wiryo sitting on the bed. Wiryo tries to say something to her, and she attempts to calm him down, urging him to lie back on the bed. Suddenly, he gets up again, but she asks him to invoke the name of God and gently helps him lie back down. After this, when Guillem bends down again to pick up her glasses, she notices hair under the bed that suddenly moves, causing the bed to press down, startling her. However, when she gets up to check, she finds nothing unusual. As she sits back down, trying to make sense of what just happened, she hears the sound of someone breathing from the other side, but she can't see anyone there. Suddenly, she spots a jinn on the bed, which terrifies her. Tarjo rushes to her, asking what happened, and when they all go inside to check, Guillem tells them that Wiryo woke up, but they see that Wiryo is still lying on the bed. Tarjo steps out to calm down his mother, but Guillem keeps repeating that Wiryo woke up. The next day, after Mrs. Wiryo's burial, Retno confronts Wati, asking how she could be thinking about their father's will, to which Wati responds that their dad is just counting his days. Retno insists that it's still inappropriate, to which Wati retorts, "Is letting my children starve inappropriate?" She continues, "Something bad happened to me. My husband is useless, and I have to face this alone." Retno reassures her, saying, "You are not alone. You have me." To which Wati replies, "You have a good job, and you'll be leaving soon. That means my only hope is the inheritance from Dad." That evening, as the prayers begin, Retno overhears Wati discussing with Tarjo the idea of selling their father's land. Meanwhile, Inda is shocked to see Wiryo standing in the hallway, and as she moves toward him, he walks away. Inda quickly goes to his room to check on him and finds him lying in his bed. The next day, Retno notices a crowd gathering at the market, and when she approaches, she finds Tarjo and Wati arguing over their inheritance. Wati accuses Tarjo of being nothing more than a drunk and the son of a mistress, to which Tarjo retorts that his mother was legally married to their father and calls Wati's husband useless. Enraged, Wati slaps him, prompting Retno to step in and try to defuse the situation, and before leaving, Tarjo declares that Wati will get what she deserves. That evening, during prayers, Guillaume tells Retno that she needs to use the bathroom. However, instead of going there, she sneaks into Viryo's room, and just as she is about to place an amulet under his pillow, Wati and Retno enter, and Wati asks what she's doing there. She then notices something in Guillaume's hand and asks what it is, but when Guillaume remains quiet, Wati approaches and snatches it away, and when she opens the pouch, she finds an amulet in it. Wati accuses Guillaume, "Isn't it enough your son demands more inheritance? Now you want to hasten our father's death?" Guillaume tries to explain, claiming she only wants to protect Wiryo, and pleads with Retno to believe her. However, Retno coldly tells her to leave. Later, the village elder, Siafat, gently asks Retno why she stopped reciting the Quran. Retno hesitates, unable to provide an answer, to which he reassures her, saying, "It's okay, and whenever she feels like talking, he'll be here to listen." That night, Wati wakes up to the unsettling sight of Wiryo sitting upright on the bed, trembling with fear. She calls out to him, but he suddenly grabs her hand with a grip so strong that she struggles to free herself. Desperately, she tells him to go back to sleep, and after a tense moment, Wiryo slowly lies back down, releasing her hand. Shaken, Wati calls out to Retno, but when there's no response, she decides to leave, and just as she's heading out, Wiryo abruptly grabs her by the throat, and after a chilling moment, he forcefully pushes her away and vanishes. Stunned, Wati looks back and is horrified to see Wiryo still lying motionless on the bed, as if nothing had happened. Terrified, Wati leaves for home, but streetlights behind her flicker off one by one. Suddenly, she hears Wiryo calling her name, and when she turns, she sees Wiryo standing at a distance. The light goes off, and when it turns back on, a jinn sits ominously in Wiryo's place, and the jinn begins to rise slowly, its presence growing more menacing. And before Wati can comprehend the danger, the jinn starts advancing toward her. Panicking, Wati turns and tries to run, but the lights ahead of her also begin shutting off, and the jinn lunges at her. The next day, Retno reflects on the past, remembering the moment when Mrs. Wiryo discovered that Wiryo had taken a second wife solely because he wanted a son. Just then, Inda informs Ratna that something has happened, and as they depart, the family photo frame suddenly cracks. They both rush outside, and to their horror, they discover Wati's lifeless body lying there. Meanwhile, Tarjo notices Wiryo in his house. However, when he looks in that direction, no one is there, but moments later, he sees Wiryo in the room in front of him. Confused, Tarjo cautiously approaches him, calling him out, but suddenly, Wiryo says he will come and then vanishes. That night, Retno confronts Baguz about his irresponsibility, to which he tells her she doesn't understand how difficult it was to be Wati's husband. Every time he tried to take responsibility as the head of the family, it was never enough for her, and that night, he had already asked her to come home with him, but, as usual, she made him feel unimportant and unwanted. The next morning, two policemen visit Retno, and one of them mentions that they learned Wati and Tarjo had an argument at the market. Retno confirms this and explains that they were discussing inheritance. She adds that Tarjo had threatened Wati, saying, "You will get what you deserve." Afterward, the policemen arrive at Tarjo's house and inform him that they have a search warrant, and when Tarjo asks what it's about, the lead officer ignores his question and orders the team to start searching. As the officers begin their search, Tarjo protests, insisting they won't find anything incriminating. However, one officer discovers a blood-stained knife in the kitchen and brings it to the lead officer. Tarjo immediately denies ownership of the knife, but the lead officer insists he accompany them for further questioning. At that moment, Guillaume steps out, and the officer explains that they are only doing their job. But seizing the opportunity, Tarjo breaks free and escapes. That evening, GM visits Retno and assures her that Tarjo would never hurt Wadi, as he deeply respects both of them because, regardless of their differences, they share the same father. Retno apologizes and suggests they leave the matter to the police. Then, she asks Guillaume what she was holding on the night of the prayers, to which Guillaume reveals that their father has a protector, explaining it is a jinn residing in his body. She shares that her father once admitted that the jinn would eventually bring him misery, and all she wants is for him to have a peaceful death. That's why she brought the amulet to help rid him of the jinn. Meanwhile, Tarjo is hiding in a place when he notices a man repeatedly banging his head against a wooden wall. Scared, Tarjo calls out to him, causing the man to briefly stop. However, moments later, the man starts banging his head even harder. Terrified, Tarjo looks around and sees the man standing on the other side. And when he looks back, the man is gone. Suddenly, the figure moves toward him, causing Tarjo to fall and prompting him to flee in panic. However, as he runs, he hears Wiryo calling his name, but cannot see anyone. Trembling with fear, Tarjo walks backward cautiously until he collides with the jinn. The jinn turns toward him, and in sheer terror, Tarjo falls to the ground before scrambling to run away. However, while escaping, his leg gets injured, causing him to collapse outside the place. As Tarjo inspects his injured leg, the jinn suddenly grabs his other leg, sending a wave of terror through him. And to his shock, he sees the jinn emerging from the ground, slowly advancing toward him. Paralyzed with fear, Tarjo watches helplessly as it gets closer. But just then, Inda appears at the scene, and Tarjo realizes that jinn has vanished. Meanwhile, Retno wakes up to the sound of Wiryo calling her name. Concerned, she rushes to his room, and Wiryo tells her he can't take it anymore and wants to die. Retno, determined, reassures him that she won't give up on him. However, Wiryo says it's no use. Suddenly, he lurches forward and spits blood onto her, leaving her horrified. He then pleads with her to promise she'll let him die. And as Retno glances at the Quran nearby, Wiryo's condition worsens, and she desperately asks him to repeat a sunnah after her. Wiryo attempts to comply, but abruptly pauses, sensing a strange presence in the room, and the door to his room slowly starts to creak open. Retno, scared, turns towards the door to check, but sees no one is there, and just then, she is startled by the sound of Izmi's screams echoing through the house. As Retno enters her room, Izmi anxiously tells her she had a dream that Retno died. Trying to calm her, Retno reassures her that she's right there and reminds her it was only a dream. Retno then asks if she is feeling okay, explaining that she needs to check on her father. However, just as she's about to leave, the lights suddenly go out, and Izmi pleads with Retno not to leave her. Deciding to stay, Retno lies down beside Izmi to comfort her. But just then, Izmi's voice calls out from the other side of the room, asking Retno what she is doing in her room. Frozen in fear, Retno turns to see the jinn beside her, who grabs her face and leans over her menacingly, leaving her paralyzed with terror. After what feels like an eternity, Inda comes there, and Izmi collapses, and the jinn vanishes. Inda tries to wake Izmi up, and Retno quickly joins her. After a tense moment, Izmi wakes up screaming in agony, crying out that it hurts, and when they check her back, they are left utterly shocked by what they see. Retno meets Siafa and confides in him, explaining that ever since her father took a second wife, their lives have fallen apart. She admits she was angry at God for allowing such things to happen to her family, so she stopped praying and reciting the Quran. Siafat hands her an old notebook of hers, urging her to read the last surah she had written before she stopped reciting. Retno opens the notebook and begins to read, and Siafa explains the meaning. Your Lord has not abandoned you, nor has he become hateful of you. He gently reminds her that while she may have turned away from God in anger, God is most compassionate and merciful and never abandons his servants. Retno tearfully admits that all she wants is for her father to pass away peacefully, to which Siafat promises to help her. He then tells her that, based on what she said, he believes the jinn has a purpose. She asks, "What does the jinn want?" To which he says, "We must find out." And when she asks what he means, he replies, "Let's call upon this entity." Retno sits down to summon the jinn following the method Siafat had described, and as the clock strikes midnight, she begins reciting the chant to summon the jinn. Almost immediately, she hears unsettling sounds coming from the ceiling, as if someone is walking above her. Though frightened, she continues chanting, and after a while, the plate placed in front of her starts to shake violently. Watching in terror, she notices everything suddenly becoming eerily calm, and to her utter horror, she sees Wiryo sitting on his bed with the jinn standing ominously behind him. Retno gathers her courage and asks, "Who are you?" To which the jinn responds, "I am Wiryo, and Wiryo is me." Retno then asks, "What do you want?" To which it says, "You." Terrified, Retno suddenly turns around, only to see Wiryo lying motionless on his bed, and the jinn seemingly gone. As she begins to rise, we see the jinn standing in the shadows of a corner behind her. Unaware, Retno moves toward her father to check on him, and as she turns to leave, Wiryo unexpectedly calls out to her. Startled, she turns back, but the jinn lunges at her, pushing her towards the wall. Despite the attack, Retno manages to free herself and bolts out of the room, desperate to escape. The next day, Retno tells Siafat that he was right about the jinn keeping her father alive, to which Siafat tells her that besides prayers, they must try their best, and he will help her tonight. Meanwhile, Tarjo wonders how the knife ended up in his house, and frustrated, he declares he is leaving this village. Inda begins to cry, and when he asks her what's wrong, she tearfully apologizes to him. Confused, he says, she has been helping him, so why she is apologizing? It is then revealed that on that fateful night, Inda murdered Wati by stabbing her with that very knife, and after committing the act, she took the knife and hid it in Tarjo's house. Shocked, Tarjo asks, "How could you?" To which Inda replies, "It was the only way to help my daughter." Furious, Tarjo lunges at her, attempting to strangle her, but soon his body suddenly stiffens, and he collapses backward. Moments later, blood begins to flow from his mouth, and Tarjo dies on the spot. And Inda, grabbing the tiffin containing the poisoned food, runs away from the scene. Later, the villagers discover Tarjo's lifeless body, and when Retno arrives at the scene, she is equally horrified and stunned by the sight. That evening, as Retno and Siafat prepare for the prayers, he says, "This glass of water will serve as a sign," explaining that if they succeed, the water will disappear on its own. He then begins reciting the prayers, while Retno bathes Wiryo with trembling hands. After a while, Wiryo suddenly jerks, startling Retno, and Siafat quickly instructs her, "Don't stop. Keep going." Suddenly, Izmi screams, prompting Inda to rush to her. She helps her daughter to sit up and is horrified to see that the wounds on her back have worsened significantly. Meanwhile, Wiryo begins to levitate above the table, freezing Retno momentarily, but Siafat urges her to keep going. Summoning her courage, Retno continues bathing Wiryo, and Siafat notices the water in the glass beginning to disappear, but at the same time, blood begins to ooze out from Izmi's wounds. Finally, Wiryo descends slowly back onto the table, but at that exact moment, Izmi's body goes still. Outside, Siafat turns to Retno and says, "We did it." However, Inda storms out and Siafat quickly pushes Retno aside, placing himself in the path of the attack, leaving him gasping in shock and pain. Retno confronts Inda, yelling, "Are you out of your mind?" To which Inda says, "Everything I did was for Izmi," and reveals that Izmi is her little sister. Retno stands frozen, shocked by the revelation, and in a flashback, it is revealed that years ago, Wiryo had forced himself upon Inda, resulting in her pregnancy. Years later, Mrs. Wiryo visited a shaman to curse her husband, but was told a powerful force protected him, and the curse might backfire. She then asked about targeting his youngest daughter. Izmi fell ill due to the curse, and Wiryo promised Inda that once he reached Jogja, he would send her protector to help Izmi recover. However, on the same day, he was involved in an accident on the way. Inda says that after Viryo's death, the jinn will transfer to one of his children, and she must ensure it moves to Izmi so the black magic curse can be lifted. She then attacks Retno, who dodges her, and runs into the house for safety. However, Inda follows and catches her. A struggle ensues as Inda attempts to kill Retno, but Retno fights back, and both fall to the ground. Inda tries again, and ultimately manages to stab Retno, causing a glass to shatter, which awakens Wiryo, and he begins levitating in the air. As Retno collapses on the floor, Inda bursts into tears, apologizing profusely to her, and moments later, Retno dies. However, suddenly, Retno comes back to life. Frozen with fear, Inda watches as the jinn manifests and approaches Retno, and through Wiryo, the jinn speaks, commanding Retno to say, "You are willing to accept me, and I shall save your life." Terrified, Retno utters, "I am willing." And as she does, Wiryo collapses on the ground, and Retno gets up, now possessed by the jinn. Inda watches in horror as Retno pulls the knife from her own body, and desperate to escape, Inda attempts to flee, but Retno follows her, screaming and blocking her path. Panicked, Inda rushes toward the door, only to find it locked, and as Retno charges after her to kill her, Inda runs away and locks herself in a room. Retno begins banging her head against the door, attempting to break it down, and after a tense pause, she violently breaks through, causing Inda to scream in terror. Retno then opens the door and advances toward Inda to kill her, and in a desperate attempt to survive, Inda fights back, but Retno easily overpowers her and throws her away. Inda tries to crawl away, but Retno grabs her, and just before she could kill her, Ismi calls out to her mom, causing Retno to stop. Leaving Inda behind, Retno walks to Ismi, and when Inda crawls into the room, she sees Retno sitting on the bed, holding Ismi close, and the jinn looms menacingly behind them. Inda pleads with Retno not to harm Ismi, offering her own life instead. Retno, however, reassures Ismi, saying, "This will hurt, but you will be healed." Ignoring Inda's desperate cries, Retno slits Ismi's arm and pulls out strands of hair embedded within. She hands the hair to the jinn, which consumes them instantly. Retno releases Ismi, who rushes to her mother, exclaiming, "I feel better now." The jinn then stands tall, releasing Retno from its possession, and then it vanishes. Later, the police arrive and arrest Inda, and as she is taken away, the screen fades to black, marking the end of the story. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the chills, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a scare. Until next time, stay spooky.